My name is Diana, and the apartment I'm about to tell you about wasn't just a place to live. It was the first thing I ever claimed as entirely my own. I found it after months of searching through listings that blurred together, each one feeling wrong in small ways I couldn't name. But when I stepped into this particular space on a gray Tuesday afternoon, something shifted. The windows faced east, letting morning light pool across the hardwood floors. The kitchen was small but functional, with counter space that felt generous enough for someone who had learned to cook in cramped corners. There was a bedroom with a door that locked, a bathroom with a mirror I could stand in front of without feeling watched, and most importantly, there was silence. Not the hollow kind that makes you aware of loneliness, but the full kind that wraps around you like safety. I signed the lease 3 days later, using money I had saved over 2 years of working double shifts at the hospital where I worked as a nurse. Every dollar had been earned through patience and sacrifice, stored away in an account my family didn't know existed. I furnished the apartment slowly, thoughtfully, choosing each piece with care. A second-hand couch, I reupholstered myself in deep blue fabric. A small wooden table I found at an estate sale, and refinished until the grain showed through like buried light curtains I sewed from fabric I bought on sale, thick enough to keep the world out when I needed it to. I hung pictures on the walls, photographs I had taken myself during early morning walks. When the city was still quiet, I placed plants on the windowsills and learned their names and needs. I created a space that reflected who I was when no one was watching, when I didn't have to perform or shrink or accommodate. For 3 months, I lived there in peace, so complete it felt like healing. I would come home after long shifts, unlock the door, and feel my shoulders drop as I stepped inside. I would make tea and sit by the window, watching the neighborhood settle into evening. I would read without interruption, sleep without anxiety, wake without dread. The apartment became a cocoon, and inside it, I began to remember what it felt like to breathe fully. I hadn't told my family about the apartment. The decision was deliberate, born from years of learning that sharing my life with them meant losing control of it. But one Saturday morning, everything changed. I had left early for a shift at the hospital, locking the door behind me as always. When I returned that evening, tired but content, I found my mother's car parked in front of my building. My stomach tightened immediately, instinct warning me before logic could catch up. I climbed the stairs to my floor, and as I approached my door, I heard voices inside. Not muffled or distant, but clear and close, as if the people speaking owned the space they occupied. I unlocked the door and stepped into a scene that made the ground tilt beneath me. My mother stood in my kitchen, opening cabinets and closing them with the casual authority of someone inspecting their own property. My father sat on my couch, his feet propped on my coffee table, remote control in hand as he flipped through channels on my television. And in the center of it all stood my younger sister, Vanessa, holding a measuring tape and making notes on her phone. They turned to look at me, but there was no surprise in their faces, no embarrassment at being caught somewhere they shouldn't be. Instead, my mother smiled, the kind of smile that presents itself as warmth, but carries the weight of decisions already made. She said my name like a greeting, as if I had just arrived at her house instead of my own. Vanessa didn't even bother with pleasantries. She looked at me with the easy confidence of someone who had never been denied anything, and said that the apartment was perfect for her. She said it simply, matter-of-factly, as though we were discussing the weather. She added that she would be moving in next week and that I should probably start clearing out some closet space. The words hung in the air between us, so absurd I almost laughed. But when I looked at my mother's face, I saw no indication that this was a joke or a misunderstanding. She nodded along with Vanessa's statement, and added that it made sense for me to share the apartment. She said I had always been independent and good at making things work. She said Vanessa was going through a difficult time and needed stability. She said family helps family, and that I should understand that by now I stood there, still holding my work bag, and felt something cold settle in my chest. This was not a request. This was an announcement. They had already decided, already planned, already moved forward without consulting me. My father finally spoke, his voice carrying that familiar tone of vague reasonableness he used whenever he wanted to avoid conflict. He said I was overreacting before I had even reacted. He said it wasn't a big deal, that sisters share spaces all the time, that I should stop being dramatic. I looked at Vanessa, who was still scrolling through her phone, already mentally arranging furniture that wasn't hers. I looked at my mother, who had that patient expression she wore when she was waiting for me to accept reality. I looked at my father, who wouldn't meet my eyes. And I realized that if I argued in that moment, if I raised my voice or demanded they leave, it would be framed as selfishness. They would turn my resistance into evidence of my coldness, my lack of family loyalty, my failure to be the person they needed me to be. So I said nothing. I stood in my own apartment and let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable for them instead of me. Eventually, my mother sighed and said they would talk about the details later. They gathered their things, my mother reminding Vanessa to take measurements of the bedroom, and they left. The door closed behind them, and I stood alone in the space that no longer felt entirely mine. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my small kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, and thought about every moment in my life that had led to this one. I thought about being 10 years old and giving up my birthday party because Vanessa was sick and needed attention. I thought about being 15 and lending Vanessa money I had saved from babysitting, money she never returned. I thought about being 20 and coming home from college to find my childhood bedroom had been converted into Vanessa's art studio. Without anyone asking me first, I thought about every time I had been told I was strong enough to handle disappointment, while Vanessa was shielded from every consequence and hardship. Before we go any further, I need to pause and ask you something. This is Revenge Stories, a home for quiet courage and true endings. If you feel my words, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Help us build this community so we can bring more interesting and exciting stories for you from around the world. Your help is much appreciated. Your voice matters here. Your story matters too. Now, let me tell you how I grew up, because understanding that will help you understand why their intrusion felt like something much deeper than inconvenience. I was born into a family that looked normal from the outside. We lived in a decent neighborhood in Riverside, a town where people knew each other's names and waved from their porches. My parents worked steady jobs. My father managed a hardware store. My mother worked part-time at a dental office. We had dinner together most nights. We went to church on Sundays. From the outside, we probably looked like the kind of family people aspire to have. But inside our house, there was an invisible architecture that governed everything. Vanessa was 3 years younger than me. And from the moment she was born, she occupied a different category of existence. She was the baby, the delicate one, the one who needed extra care and attention. When she cried, the house rearranged itself around her comfort. When she struggled, everyone dropped what they were doing to help. When she failed, it was never her fault. There was always an explanation, an excuse, a reason why the rules didn't apply to her the way they applied to me. I learned early that asking why led nowhere productive. When I was 12 and Vanessa was 9, I asked my mother why Vanessa didn't have to do chores while I spent every Saturday cleaning the house. My mother looked at me with a mixture of surprise and disappointment, as if I had asked something cruel. She said Vanessa was more sensitive than me, that chores overwhelmed her, that I was capable of handling more responsibility. The answer was delivered with such certainty that questioning it further felt like arguing with gravity. When I was 14, I wanted to join the school's drama club, something I had been excited about for months. But Vanessa decided she wanted to take piano lessons, and my parents said they could only afford one extracurricular activity. I was told that drama was just a hobby, while piano was a real skill. Vanessa got her lessons. I stayed home. When I was 16, I saved money from a part-time job at a coffee shop to buy a laptop for school. I had researched models, compared prices, waited for sales. The day I finally had enough money, Vanessa's car broke down. My mother asked if I could lend Vanessa the money to fix it, just temporarily. Just until they could pay me back, I handed over the cash, knowing even then that I would never see it again. I was right. These moments accumulated like sediment, layering into something solid and immovable. I learned that my needs were negotiable while Vanessa's were sacred. I learned that my disappointment was a test of my maturity. While her disappointment was a crisis requiring intervention, I learned that love in my family was not distributed equally. It was distributed according to who demanded it most loudly. My father's role in all of this was passive but no less damaging. He rarely argued with my mother's decisions. He would sit quietly, occasionally nodding, sometimes offering a vague statement of agreement. When I tried to talk to him privately to explain how unfair things felt, he would pat my shoulder and tell me that life wasn't fair, that I was strong enough to handle it, that complaining wouldn't change anything. His silence felt like abandonment, a refusal to see me even when I was standing right in front of him. Vanessa, for her part, learned to navigate this system with ease. She knew exactly how to play the role of the fragile, misunderstood younger sister. She could summon tears on command, twist situations to make herself the victim, and extract sympathy from anyone within reach. She wasn't stupid. She was strategic. And because our parents had spent her entire life reinforcing that strategy, she had no reason to change. By the time I graduated high school, I had built walls around myself that no one in my family could see. I smiled when expected. I helped when asked. I kept my frustrations private. But internally, I was planning my escape. I worked 2 jobs through college, saving every dollar I could. I applied for scholarships and grants. I lived in the cheapest dorms, ate the cheapest meals, wore the same clothes until they frayed. I was determined to build a life where I didn't have to negotiate for space, where my worth wasn't measured by how much I could endure without complaint. When I became a nurse, I felt a kind of freedom I had never experienced before. I had a career, a steady income, independence. I moved into a small studio apartment, then eventually into the 1-bedroom I would come to love. I kept my family at arm's length, visiting only when necessary, sharing only the most surface-level details of my life. They didn't notice my distance because they had never been paying close attention to begin with. And then, 3 months into living in my own apartment, they showed up. Not to visit, not to check on me, but to take. That night after they left, I sat in the silence of my apartment and made a decision I would not share my space. I would not negotiate. I would not let them rewrite the story of my life to suit Vanessa's needs. I would act, and I would not apologize for it. The next morning, I woke with absolute clarity. I made coffee, fed my cat Luna, who had been hiding under the bed since my family's intrusion, and then I picked up my phone. The first call I made was to a locksmith. I explained that I needed my locks changed immediately, that it was urgent, that I would pay extra for same-day service. The locksmith arrived within 2 hours. He was an older man with kind eyes who didn't ask unnecessary questions. He removed the old locks, installed new ones, and handed me a set of keys. I thanked him, paid him in cash, and felt the first flicker of relief. The second call I made was to a friend, Marcus, who worked in property management. I asked him about my rights as a tenant, about whether my family could legally claim any access to my apartment. He confirmed what I already suspected. The apartment was mine. The lease was in my name. No one else had any legal right to enter, regardless of their relationship to me. He also suggested I document everything, keep records of any attempts they made to contact me or enter the space. I thanked him and hung up, feeling more certain with every passing moment. The third thing I did was go through my apartment and remove every trace of my family's presence. There weren't many. My mother had left a scarf on the back of a chair. My father had left a coffee mug in the sink. Vanessa had left a notebook on the counter, filled with sketches and measurements and plans for rearranging my furniture. I gathered these items, placed them in a box, and sealed it with tape. I would return them eventually, but not yet. Not until I was ready, I spent the rest of that day cleaning, not because the apartment was dirty, but because I needed to reclaim it. I scrubbed the kitchen counters, I vacuumed every corner. I washed the windows until the glass was perfectly clear. I rearranged the furniture back to exactly how it had been before their visit. I lit candles and let the scent replace the lingering trace of my mother's perfume. By the time evening arrived, the apartment felt like mine again. Luna emerged from her hiding spot and curled up on the couch beside me. Purring softly, I stroked her fur and felt something unclench in my chest. That night I texted my mother. I kept the message brief and clear. I told her that I would not be sharing my apartment with Vanessa, that I had changed the locks, and that I needed space from the family for a while. I did not offer explanations or justifications. I did not apologize. I simply stated the facts and turned off my phone. I knew what would come next. I knew there would be calls, messages, accusations. But I also knew I had done the right thing. The response came faster than I expected. By the next morning, my phone was flooded with messages. My mother's texts were long and frantic, filled with disbelief and hurt. She said I was being cruel, that I was abandoning my sister, that family didn't treat each other this way. She said I had always been selfish, that I had always put myself first, that this was just more evidence of my lack of compassion. She demanded I call her immediately. She demanded I reconsider. She demanded I explain myself. My father's messages were shorter but no less cutting. He said I was overreacting, that I was making a bigger deal out of this than it needed to be, that I should grow up and stop being dramatic. He said I owed Vanessa an apology. He said I owed all of them an apology. He said I was tearing the family apart. Vanessa's messages were the most manipulative. She didn't yell or accuse. Instead, she wrote long paragraphs about how hurt she was, how confused, how she didn't understand what she had done wrong. She said she thought we were close, that she thought I cared about her, that she never would have expected me to turn my back on her when she needed help. She said she was going through a hard time, that she had just lost her job, that she was struggling financially and emotionally. She said I was the only person she could count on, and I had let her down. I read every message. I let the words wash over me without letting them sink in. I recognized the patterns, the guilt trips, the emotional manipulation. I had seen these tactics my entire life, and they no longer worked on me. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I blocked their numbers. I blocked them on social media. I removed myself from the family group chat. It felt like cutting cords that had been wrapped around my throat for years. With each block, I could breathe a little easier. Days passed. Then a week. The silence was strange at first, unsettling in its completeness. I kept expecting the phone to ring, kept expecting to hear a knock at the door. But nothing came. I went to work, came home, lived my life. I cooked meals for one. I watched movies without interruption. I slept through the night without waking in panic. Slowly, the apartment stopped feeling like a place I had to defend. It started feeling like a home again. But I knew the silence wouldn't last forever, and I was right. 2 weeks after I blocked them, I came home from a late shift at the hospital to find my mother and Vanessa sitting on the steps outside my building. It was nearly midnight, and they were waiting in the cold, their breath visible in the air. When they saw me approaching, they both stood. My mother's face was drawn and tired, but her eyes were hard. Vanessa looked smaller somehow, wrapped in an oversized coat, her expression carefully arranged into something that resembled sadness. I stopped a few feet away from them, my keys already in my hand. My mother spoke first. She said they needed to talk, that this had gone on long enough, that it was time for me to stop being childish. I told her there was nothing to talk about, that I had made my decision clear. She stepped closer, her voice rising. She said I couldn't just cut them out, that I couldn't just walk away from family. She said Vanessa was struggling, that she had nowhere else to go, that I was the only one who could help. I looked at Vanessa, who was staring at the ground, her shoulders hunched. I waited for her to say something, but she didn't. She just stood there, letting my mother speak for her, playing the role she had perfected over a lifetime. I turned back to my mother and said that Vanessa was an adult. I said she was capable of finding her own housing, getting her own job, solving her own problems. I said it was not my responsibility to fix her life. My mother's face twisted with anger. She said I was heartless. She said I had changed, that I wasn't the daughter she raised. She said I should be ashamed of myself. Her words were sharp, meant to cut, but they bounced off me like stones thrown at a wall. I had heard these accusations before. I had internalized them for years, but I didn't believe them anymore. I told her I wasn't going to argue. I told her I wasn't going to let them into my apartment. I told her they needed to leave. My mother stared at me, disbelief and rage warring in her expression. Vanessa finally looked up, her eyes wet with tears that may or may not have been real. She said my name softly, pleadingly, but I didn't respond. I walked past them, unlocked the door to my building, and stepped inside. Without looking back, I heard my mother call after me, her voice echoing in the stairwell. But I kept walking. I climbed the stairs to my floor, unlocked my apartment, and closed the door behind me. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from adrenaline, from the sheer force of holding my ground. Luna greeted me at the door, meowing softly. I picked her up and held her close, feeling her warmth against my chest. I stood in the quiet of my apartment, the one I had fought to keep, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt proud. The weeks that followed were strange and liberating in equal measure. My family tried a few more times to reach me. They sent emails, they left notes on my car. They even had a distant cousin call me, someone I barely knew, to tell me how worried everyone was. But I didn't engage. I had drawn a line and I refused to let anyone pull me back across it. At work, I threw myself into my routines. The hospital was chaotic and demanding, but it was also a place where my skills mattered, where I was valued for what I could do rather than what I was willing to sacrifice. My coworkers became a kind of chosen family, people who respected boundaries and showed up without expectation. I started going out with them after shifts, joining them for dinners and drinks, slowly rebuilding a social life that didn't revolve around guilt and obligation. One evening, about a month after everything began, I was having coffee with my friend and coworker, Jade. She had heard bits and pieces of my story, and that night she asked me how I was really doing. I told her the truth. I told her I felt lighter, freer, but also a little unmoored. I told her that cutting off my family had been necessary, but it still left a strange emptiness, a space where something had once been, even if that something had been painful. Jade listened without judgment. Then she said something that stayed with me. She said that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself. She said that family isn't just about blood, it's about respect, love, and safety. And if those things aren't present, then family is just a word. Her words settled into me, filling some of the empty space with something solid and true. Life continued. I started taking an evening pottery class, something I had always wanted to try. I adopted a second cat, a scruffy little thing named Pepper, who had been abandoned at the shelter. I painted my bedroom a soft, calming green. I bought new sheets, new towels, new dishes. I made my apartment into a place that reflected not just who I was, but who I was becoming. Someone who didn't apologize for taking up space. Someone who didn't shrink to make others comfortable. Someone who knew her worth. And then, one Saturday afternoon, everything came to a head in a way I never expected. I was at the farmer's market that Saturday, browsing through stalls of fresh produce and handmade goods, when I ran into someone I never thought I would see again. Her name was Caroline, and she had been Vanessa's best friend all through high school and college. We had never been close, but we had always been cordial, existing in each other's periphery through years of birthday parties and family gatherings. When she saw me, her face lit up with recognition, and she waved me over enthusiastically. We exchanged pleasantries, the kind of surface-level conversation that happens between people who share history but not intimacy. She asked how I was doing, and I gave her the standard responses, "Fine, busy with work, keeping well." But then her expression shifted, becoming more serious, more careful. She said she had heard about what happened between me and my family. She said Vanessa had been posting about it online, telling everyone who would listen that I had abandoned her in her time of need. I felt my stomach tighten, but I kept my face neutral. I asked her what exactly Vanessa had been saying. Caroline hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but then she pulled out her phone and showed me Vanessa's social media was filled with long, emotional posts about betrayal and family loyalty. She had written about how I had cruelly locked her out of an apartment we were supposed to share. She had written about how I had cut off the entire family without explanation. She had written about how she was now struggling to find housing and support because her sister had turned her back on her. The posts were carefully crafted, designed to elicit sympathy, and the comments section was flooded with supportive messages from people who didn't know the full story. I handed the phone back to Caroline, feeling a familiar weight settle in my chest. But this time, it wasn't the weight of guilt. It was the weight of recognition. I saw exactly what Vanessa was doing. She was rewriting the narrative, casting herself as the victim and me as the villain. It was a pattern I had seen play out my entire life. Just on a larger scale now. Caroline watched me carefully, and then she said something that surprised me. She said she didn't believe Vanessa's version of events. She said she had known Vanessa long enough to recognize when she was manipulating a situation. She said she had watched Vanessa get away with things for years, because people always gave her the benefit of the doubt, always assumed she was fragile and in need of protection. She said she was sorry for not saying something sooner, for not standing up for me when we were younger. Her words caught me off guard. I had spent so long assuming that everyone saw Vanessa the way my parents did, that everyone believed the story she told about herself. But here was someone who had been on the inside, someone who had witnessed the same dynamics I had, and she was validating my experience. It felt like air rushing into a room that had been sealed shut for years. We talked for another hour, standing there in the middle of the farmer's market while people flowed around us. Caroline told me stories I had never heard before. Times when Vanessa had lied to get out of trouble, times when she had used people and discarded them when they were no longer useful, times when she had played the victim to avoid taking responsibility. Caroline said she had distanced herself from Vanessa over the past year because the friendship had become exhausting, because Vanessa only called when she needed something, because the relationship was entirely one-sided. Before we parted ways, Caroline gave me her number and told me to reach out if I ever needed someone to talk to. She said she admired what I had done, that it took courage to set boundaries with family, especially when those boundaries were met with resistance and manipulation. She said she hoped I knew I had made the right choice. I thanked her, feeling something shift inside me. I had made the right choice. I knew that. But hearing it from someone else, someone who understood the context, made it feel more real, more solid. That evening, I sat in my apartment and thought about what to do with the knowledge of Vanessa's posts. Part of me wanted to respond, to tell my side of the story, to correct the record. But another part of me, the wiser part, knew that engaging would only give Vanessa what she wanted. She wanted a reaction. She wanted me to defend myself publicly, so she could twist my words and play the victim even more convincingly. The truth was, the people who mattered, the people who actually knew me, didn't need me to explain myself. And the people who believed Vanessa without question were never going to be convinced otherwise. So I did nothing. I let her tell her story. I let the comments pile up. I let her paint me as the villain. And I went on living my life, unbothered by the narrative she was constructing in a space I no longer occupied. But my mother, it turned out, was not content to let things remain silent. 3 days after my conversation with Caroline, I received a letter in the mail, Not an email or a text, but an actual handwritten letter, delivered in a cream-colored envelope with my name written in my mother's careful script. I stared at it for a long time before opening it, knowing that whatever was inside would be an attempt to pull me back into the cycle I had worked so hard to escape. When I finally opened it, I found 3 pages of dense, emotional writing. My mother's words were a mixture of pleading, guilt-tripping, and accusations. She wrote that she didn't recognize the person I had become, that the daughter she raised would never abandon her family like this. She wrote that Vanessa was suffering, that she was depressed and barely eating, that she cried every night because of what I had done. She wrote that my father was disappointed in me, that he had always thought I was the strong one, the reliable one, but now he saw me as selfish and cold. She wrote that I had a responsibility to my sister, that family was supposed to support each other, that I was breaking a sacred bond by refusing to help. The letter went on and on, each paragraph a different variation of the same message. I was wrong, I was cruel, I needed to apologize and make things right. But woven through all the accusations and pleas was something else. Something my mother probably didn't even realize she was revealing. Every example she gave, every story she told to illustrate Vanessa's suffering, was actually evidence of Vanessa's refusal to take responsibility for her own life. She wrote about how Vanessa had been late on rent multiple times and was now being evicted from her apartment. She wrote about how Vanessa had quit another job because she didn't get along with her manager. She wrote about how Vanessa had maxed out her credit cards and couldn't afford to pay them off. She wrote about all of this as though these were tragedies that had happened to Vanessa. Rather than consequences of Vanessa's own choices, I read the letter twice, and then I folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. I didn't respond. I didn't call. I didn't write back. Because there was nothing I could say that would change my mother's perspective. She had spent Vanessa's entire life enabling her, protecting her from consequences, and teaching her that someone would always be there to clean up her messes. And now, when I refused to play that role, my mother couldn't understand why. She couldn't see that she had created the very situation she was now asking me to fix. The weeks turned into months. Spring arrived, bringing longer days and warmer air. I watched the city come alive from my apartment windows, feeling more grounded in my life than I ever had before I got a promotion at the hospital, a recognition of the work I had been putting in for years. I started dating someone, a kind and thoughtful man named Eric who worked as a teacher and who respected my need for independence. I traveled for the first time in years, taking a long weekend trip to the coast with Jade, where we stayed in a small bed and breakfast and spent our days walking along the beach. My life was full in a way it had never been when my family was in it. I had space to grow, to explore, to become whoever I wanted to be without constant pressure to shrink myself. I had friendships built on mutual respect rather than obligation. I had routines that brought me joy rather than dread. I had peace. But peace, I learned, is something some people cannot tolerate in others, especially when their own lives are falling apart. It was a Tuesday evening in late May when everything reached its breaking point. I had just gotten home from work and was changing into comfortable clothes when I heard a commotion outside my building. Voices raised, someone shouting. I looked out the window and saw a scene that made my heart sink. Vanessa was standing on the sidewalk below, surrounded by several large boxes and suitcases. My mother was with her, and they were arguing with my landlord, Mr. Patterson, a patient man in his 60s who had always been kind to me. I couldn't hear the exact words, but I could see the situation clearly. They were trying to move Vanessa's belongings into the building, and Mr. Patterson was blocking their way. I grabbed my keys and headed downstairs, knowing I needed to intervene before this escalated further. When I stepped outside, all 3 of them turned to look at me. Vanessa's face was red and blotchy, her eyes swollen from crying. My mother's expression was desperate and angry in equal measure. Mr. Patterson looked relieved to see me. He said my name and explained that these women were claiming they had the right to move into my apartment, that they were family, and I had agreed to let them stay. He said he had been trying to explain that he couldn't let anyone into the building without my explicit permission, but they weren't listening. I looked at my mother and Vanessa and felt a strange calm wash over me. This was it. The final boundary. The moment where I would either hold my ground completely or cave under the pressure of their desperation. I chose to hold my ground. I told Mr. Patterson that these women did not have my permission to enter the building or my apartment. I told him I had not agreed to let anyone stay with me. I thanked him for protecting my space and my rights as a tenant. He nodded, clearly grateful that I was backing him up, and he crossed his arms, making it clear that no one was getting past him. My mother erupted. She said I was being ridiculous, that I couldn't just leave my sister homeless, that this was a family emergency. She said Vanessa had been evicted from her apartment and had nowhere else to go. She said I had a 2-bedroom apartment, that there was plenty of space, that it would only be temporary until Vanessa got back on her feet. She said I was being selfish and cruel, that I was violating every principle of family loyalty. I let her finish. I let her get all the words out, let her exhaust herself with accusations. And then I spoke, my voice steady and clear. I said that Vanessa's housing situation was not my responsibility. I said that I had my own life, my own space, and my own boundaries. I said that I had told them months ago that I would not be sharing my apartment, and that decision had not changed. I said that if Vanessa needed help, she could contact social services, apply for housing assistance, reach out to friends, but she could not move into my home. Vanessa finally spoke, her voice breaking with sobs. She said she couldn't believe I was doing this to her. She said she had nowhere to go, that she had tried everything, that I was her last hope. She said she was my sister, that I was supposed to care about her. She said she didn't understand how I could be so heartless. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw someone who had never learned to stand on her own. Someone who had been taught that tears and manipulation would always get her what she wanted. Someone who had never faced real consequences because someone always stepped in to save her. And I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. I felt pity. Not the kind that would make me give in, but the kind that comes from recognizing someone's limitations. I told her I was sorry she was in this situation. I told her I hoped she found a solution, but I told her that solution would not involve me. And then I turned to Mr. Patterson and asked him to please make sure no one entered the building without proper authorization. He agreed immediately, and I went back inside, leaving my mother and Vanessa on the sidewalk with their boxes and their anger. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. My hands were shaking, my heart was pounding, but I felt no regret. I had held the line. I had protected my peace. I had chosen myself. That night, I received dozens of messages from various family members, aunts, uncles, cousins, all of them telling me how disappointed they were, how I needed to reconsider, how family was everything. I didn't respond to any of them. I simply muted the notifications and went about my evening. I made dinner, fed Luna and Pepper, and watched a movie. And for the first time in months, I felt completely, utterly free. The next day, I received a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Caroline. She said she had heard about what happened, that Vanessa had posted about it online again, this time with photos of herself sitting on the sidewalk surrounded by boxes, looking devastated. Caroline said she wanted me to know that she had commented on the post, telling people there was more to the story than what Vanessa was sharing. She said several other people, mutual acquaintances who had their own experiences with Vanessa, had done the same. The narrative was beginning to crack. Caroline told me something else, too. She said that Vanessa's eviction hadn't been a surprise or an emergency. She had been served with eviction notices months ago, had been given multiple chances to catch up on rent, and had ignored every warning. She had known for weeks that she would need to find new housing, but she had done nothing about it, apparently assuming that at the last minute someone would swoop in and save her. That someone, she had decided, would be me. This information didn't surprise me, but it did confirm what I had always suspected. Vanessa's crises were often manufactured, exaggerated, or avoidable. She created chaos because chaos brought attention, and attention brought help. It was a pattern that had worked for her entire life, but it was a pattern I would no longer participate in. Over the following weeks, I heard updates through various channels Vanessa had moved in with my parents, cramming herself into their small 2-bedroom house. The arrangement was predictably volatile. She and my mother argued constantly. She contributed nothing financially. She made no effort to find work or secure her own housing. My father, according to distant relatives who still spoke to me occasionally, was growing increasingly frustrated, but remained silent, as he always had. My mother called me one last time, about a month after the confrontation outside my building. Her voice was tired, defeated. She said that having Vanessa at home was difficult, that it was straining their marriage, that they couldn't afford to support her indefinitely. She said she understood now that I had my own life, but she still hoped I might reconsider helping, even just a little. She said she was asking not for Vanessa's sake, but for hers and my father's. I listened to her speak, and I felt a flicker of something that might have once been guilt, but it was faint, distant, easily set aside. I told her that I loved her, that I hoped things got better, but that I would not be changing my decision. I told her that Vanessa was an adult and needed to figure out her own path forward. I told her that enabling Vanessa for all these years had not helped her. It had harmed her, and I told her that I couldn't be part of that cycle anymore. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then my mother said something that surprised me. She said she was tired. She said she didn't know how things had gotten to this point. She said she sometimes wondered if they had made mistakes in how they raised us, in how they treated us differently. It wasn't quite an apology, and it wasn't quite an acknowledgement of the harm that had been done, but it was closer than she had ever come before. I told her that it was never too late to make different choices. I told her that she and my father could stop enabling Vanessa, could set boundaries, could let her face the natural consequences of her decisions. I told her it would be hard, but it would be the kindest thing they could do for her in the long run. I told her I would be here if she ever wanted to have an honest conversation, but I would not be returning to the family dynamic as it had existed before. She thanked me quietly and hung up. I never heard from her again after that call. I don't know if she took my words to heart or if things continued as they always had. I don't know if Vanessa ever found her footing or if she remained dependent on our parents indefinitely. I don't know if my father ever found his voice or if he stayed silent until the end. I don't know these things because I chose not to know. I chose to let them live their lives while I lived mine. The months continued to pass, and my life grew richer and fuller with each one. Eric and I grew closer, building a relationship based on honesty, respect, and genuine affection. He never pressured me to reconcile with my family, never suggested that I owed them anything. He simply supported my choices and loved me for who I was. We moved in together after a year, finding a new apartment with bigger windows and more light. Luna and Pepper adjusted well, claiming their favorite spots in the new space. I continued to thrive at work, taking on more responsibilities and mentoring new nurses. I found deep satisfaction in my job, in the knowledge that I was helping people, making a difference in small but meaningful ways. I continued my pottery classes and got good enough to start selling pieces at local craft fairs. I joined a book club, made new friends, traveled more. I built a life that was entirely my own, shaped by my choices and my values. Sometimes, late at night, I would think about my family. I would wonder how they were doing, whether anything had changed. I would feel a faint echo of the love I had once felt for them, before it had been buried under years of hurt and resentment. But I never reached out. The door I had closed needed to stay closed, not out of anger or spite, but out of self-preservation. Because I had learned something essential. I had learned that you cannot set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. I had learned that loyalty that demands self-destruction is not loyalty at all. I had learned that the most radical act of self-love is sometimes simply saying no. 2 years after everything began, I was walking through the park near my apartment when I saw a young woman sitting on a bench, crying. She looked to be in her early 20s, and something about her posture, the way she was hunched over as if trying to make herself smaller, reminded me of myself at that age. I hesitated for a moment, then sat down beside her and asked if she was okay. She looked up at me, startled, then shook her head. She said she had just had a fight with her family, that they were demanding she give up her apartment to let her brother move in, that they said she was being selfish for refusing. She said she felt guilty, but she also felt angry, and she didn't know what to do. I listened to her story, hearing echoes of my own in every word. When she finished, I told her about my experience. Not all of it, but enough. I told her about setting boundaries, about choosing myself, about learning that love without respect is not really love. I told her that guilt is a powerful tool people use to control others, and that she had every right to protect her own space and peace. I told her that whatever she decided, she should make sure it was a decision she could live with, not one she was making to avoid conflict or disapproval. She cried harder then, but it seemed like a different kind of crying, a release rather than despair. She thanked me multiple times, saying she had felt so alone, so wrong for wanting to say no. I gave her my number and told her to reach out if she ever needed to talk. We hugged before parting ways, and I walked home feeling like something had come full circle. That young woman did reach out several times over the following months. She told me she had held firm with her family, that it had been difficult but necessary. She said she was learning to build a life on her own terms, and that our conversation in the park had given her the courage to start. I was glad I had stopped that day, glad I had shared my story, because that's what stories are for. Not just to tell what happened, but to show others that they're not alone, that survival is possible, that choosing yourself is not selfish, it's essential. Now, as I sit here years later, I think about the journey I've traveled. From the girl who learned to be invisible to avoid conflict, to the woman who learned to take up space without apology. It wasn't an easy journey. There were moments of doubt, moments when I wondered if I had been too harsh, too unforgiving. But those moments always passed when I remembered the peace I felt in my own home, the freedom I felt in my own life. I had not been cruel. I had simply refused to be convenient. I think about Vanessa sometimes, and I hope she's okay. I hope she's learned something from our estrangement. Though I have no way of knowing if she has, I hope my parents found some measure of peace, though I suspect they're still trapped in the same patterns that defined my childhood. I hope they think of me occasionally and understand that my absence was not rejection, but self-preservation. I hope they understand that I loved them, but I loved myself more, and that loving myself was the only way I could survive. My apartment, the one I fought so hard to keep, is no longer where I live. Eric and I bought a house together, a small place with a garden and enough room for the life we're building. But that apartment will always hold a special place in my memory. It was the first place that was truly mine, the first space I defended, the first boundary I ever successfully held. It represented a turning point, a moment when I stopped letting other people write my story and picked up the pen myself. If you're listening to this and you see yourself in any part of my story, I want you to know something. You are not wrong for wanting your own space. You are not selfish for having boundaries. You are not cruel for choosing your own peace over someone else's comfort. Family is important, but it should never cost you your sense of self. And if the people who claim to love you can only do so on the condition that you sacrifice your own well-being, then that love is not worth holding on to. Setting boundaries doesn't mean you don't care. It means you care about yourself enough to protect what you've built. It means you understand that you cannot pour from an empty cup, that you cannot save someone who refuses to save themselves. It means you recognize that sometimes the most loving thing you can do, both for yourself and for others, is to step back and let people face the consequences of their own choices. I won't tell you it's easy. It's not. There will be guilt, there will be grief, there will be moments when you question everything. But on the other side of that difficulty is something precious and irreplaceable: freedom. The freedom to live according to your own values. The freedom to build a life that reflects who you actually are. The freedom to breathe without the weight of other people's expectations crushing your chest. This is Revenge Stories, a home for quiet courage and true endings. If you feel my words, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Help us build this community so we can bring more interesting and exciting stories for you from around the world. Your help is much appreciated. Your voice matters here. Your story matters too. My story didn't end with dramatic confrontations or satisfying moments of public vindication. It ended with something quieter but more profound. It ended with me waking up every morning in a home I chose, with a partner who respects me, with work that fulfills me, with friendships that sustain me. It ended with me standing in front of the mirror and recognizing the woman looking back at me. Strong, imperfect, healing, whole. The door I closed on my family was not a punishment. It was a beginning. The beginning of a life where I matter, where my needs are valid, where my boundaries are sacred. And if that makes me the villain in their story, I can live with that. Because in my own story, I'm the hero, the one who saved herself when no one else would. The one who learned that the bravest thing you can do is choose your own life over the role you were assigned. The one who discovered that love, real love, never asks you to disappear. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being here, for bearing witness, for understanding. If any part of what I've shared resonates with you, know that you're not alone. There are others out there who have walked this path, who have made these same difficult choices, who have learned these same hard lessons. We're a community bound not by blood, but by courage. The courage to say no, the courage to walk away, the courage to build something better. Your story matters. Your voice matters. Your life, the one you choose for yourself, matters more than any role someone else tries to force you into. Remember that. Hold on to it. Let it guide you when the path gets dark and the voices get loud. You deserve peace. You deserve respect. You deserve a life that's truly yours. This has been my story. I'm Diana, and I learned to close the door on everything that was taken from me without giving back. I learned to lock it tight and walk forward without looking over my shoulder. And I learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is loving yourself enough to let go. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And please, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if any of this has touched your heart or reminded you of your own journey. Let's build this space together. A space where quiet courage is celebrated, where true endings are honored, where every voice matters. Until the next story, take care of yourselves, protect your peace, honor your boundaries, and remember that you are worth fighting for.